The moment CEO Victoria Hayes saw the adoption file, her signature froze midair. Because the father's name matched the man she once loved and lost without explanation years ago. Completely welcome to Poor Girl's Destiny, where every story brings hope, kindness, and second chances. Wishing you joy, peace, and happiness today as we begin this heartfelt cinematic journey together. Now inside the glass-walled adoption office in downtown Chicago. Victoria Hayes sat perfectly still while the world outside moved in a blur of morning traffic and distant sirens. She had signed billion-dollar deals, but today her hand hovered over a simple form that could change a life, not because of money, but because of memory. Across from her, a social worker gently slid a thin folder forward marked with the name Sophie Carter, a 7-year-old girl with no known relatives, and a history written only in fragmented reports and quiet uncertainty. Victoria should have felt detached. She was trained for control, negotiations, acquisitions, power, but something in Sophie's file made her breath slow. The photograph attached showed a little girl holding a worn teddy bear, staring at the camera with eyes far too familiar for reasons she could not yet explain. The social worker cleared her throat softly, asking if she had made her decision. Victoria did not answer immediately. Instead, her eyes lingered on the surname Carter, as if the universe had folded itself into something personal and unavoidable. A faint memory flickered, not fully formed, but emotionally charged, like a song she had heard once in a different life. Ethan Carter, a name she had buried beneath years of ambition, resurfaced in the quiet corners of her mind. Outside, the rain began to fall lightly against the city windows, as if even the weather itself was aware that something important was shifting inside this room, between past and present, between love and silence. Victoria finally closed the folder, but the weight of it remained in her hands, as if paper could carry fate itself. She stood slowly, adjusting her blazer, the polished sewn mask slipping back into place, while inside something fragile had already begun to crack. She asked to see the child immediately, her voice steady but her pulse betraying a rare uncertainty that no boardroom had ever witnessed before. The social worker nodded, leading her down a quiet hallway lined with faded photographs of children who had once hoped for new beginnings. Each step Victoria took echoed softly, like a distant memory, refusing to stay buried. And there at the end of the corridor stood Sophie Carter, holding a small stuffed animal, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with an almost unsettling recognition that seemed to pierce straight through Victoria's carefully constructed world. Victoria stopped breathing for a moment, the air between them tightening, as if time itself had recognized the importance of this meeting. Sophie tilted her head slightly and whispered something so soft it nearly disappeared into the silence, but it changed everything. Victoria knelt slowly, her perfectly controlled world dissolving in real time as she reached out a trembling hand toward the child who might hold the key to a past she thought she had erased forever. Outside, the city continued to move, unaware that inside this quiet room, a reunion long buried beneath years of silence was finally beginning to awaken, something neither power nor wealth could ever control. And as Sophie stepped forward, the truth waited patiently at the edge of recognition, ready to rewrite everything they thought they knew about love, loss, and destiny forever. As silence filled the space between their hearts, once again completely still, Victoria Hayes stood alone in the upper floor of her glass office tower as the city of Chicago stretched endlessly beneath her, like a living map of ambition and noise. She had spent years building an empire where every number made sense and every decision was controlled down to the second. Yet today, control felt like something slipping quietly through her fingers. She placed the adoption file on her desk, but even when her hands left it, her mind refused to let go of the name Carter. It lingered like a shadow she could not measure or acquire. Like everything else in her world, her assistant entered softly, carrying a tablet filled with schedules and meetings, but Victoria did not look up. Instead, she stared out at the skyline, where clouds moved slowly across steel and glass, as if time itself had become uncertain. Her voice finally broke the silence, calm and precise, asking to postpone the afternoon board meeting. The assistant hesitated, but nodded, understanding that when Victoria Hayes changed her schedule, it was never without reason. Alone again, Victoria walked slowly through her office, her heels echoing across polished marble floors, each step carrying the weight of a memory she had buried under success and distance. She stopped near a wall of awards and photographs, all carefully curated images of achievements, charity galas, magazine covers, and business headlines, yet none of them felt real. In this moment, her reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, powerful, yes, but distant, as if she were looking at someone who had built a life, but forgotten how to live it. She reached for her phone, without fully understanding why, and opened a blank contact list. Her fingers hovered above the screen before stopping at a name she had not spoken in years. Ethan Carter. The memory arrived not as a single moment, but as fragments: a rainy evening, a quiet laugh, a promise made in a world that no longer existed. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, the city felt colder outside the glass doors. Her driver waited, but she instructed him to give her a moment alone. Instead, she returned to her desk and reviewed Sophie Carter's file again, this time slower, noticing details she had ignored before: the child's place of discovery, the lack of relatives, the faint note about a father still listed but unreachable. The coincidence felt too precise to be random. Yet Victoria Hayes did not believe in coincidence. She believed in structure and logic, but neither of those explained the tightening in her chest. She picked up the file once more and made a decision, not with the confidence of a CEO, but with the hesitation of someone stepping into unknown territory. She requested a private meeting with the social worker for the following morning and asked for all available information on the father, Ethan Carter. Then she paused, as if the name itself carried physical weight. She added quietly that she wanted absolute confidentiality, no press, no records, no exposure of identity outside of necessary channels. The city outside continued its rhythm, unaware that behind reinforced glass a woman who had once controlled billion-dollar decisions was now being guided by something far more fragile than strategy, something that felt dangerously close to memory. And as evening approached, Victoria remained in her office longer than usual, watching the lights of Chicago flicker on one by one like distant signals from a life she had almost forgotten, wondering why the name of a man she had not seen in years now felt like the most important variable in a future she could no longer fully predict. The next morning arrived in Chicago with a pale gray light spreading slowly across the skyline, as if the city itself was hesitating to wake fully. Victoria Hayes was already awake long before sunrise, sitting in the quiet of her penthouse, where every surface reflected order, yet none reflected peace. She had not slept well, and the reason sat once again in her mind like a locked door. She could not stop approaching. The name Ethan Carter had become more than a memory. It had become a question she could not ignore. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, her assistant arrived, carrying a new briefing folder marked confidential along with updated records from the adoption agency. Victoria accepted it without a word and immediately turned to the section labeled parental history. The file was incomplete, but it confirmed what she feared and what she did not understand. Ethan Carter, single father, last known residence on the outskirts of Evanston, Illinois, employed intermittently in mechanical and technical repair services, no criminal record, no financial stability, no further family listed. Victoria closed the file for a moment and pressed her fingertips against her temple, as if trying to physically organize the thoughts forming inside her head. A man from her past, now raising a child alone while she stood at the top of an empire she had built from nothing. The contrast should have felt simple, but instead it felt personal in a way she could not yet explain. She instructed her assistant to arrange transportation, not to a corporate meeting, but to Evanston within the hour. The assistant hesitated briefly before confirming the request and stepping out, leaving Victoria alone with a decision that no board vote could approve on. The drive north, the city slowly dissolved into quieter neighborhoods where trees replaced glass towers, and time seemed to move differently. Victoria sat in the back seat watching streets pass by, yet her focus remained inward. The memory of Ethan Carter was no longer distant. It was sharpening with every mile. She recalled fragments she had long dismissed: a shared laughter in a college courtyard, a late-night conversation about futures that once felt infinite, and a silence that came later without explanation. She had never known why he left or why she never found him again. But now fate had placed his name in front of her in a way she could no longer avoid. When the car finally stopped in front of a modest residential street, Victoria stepped out, adjusting her coat as the morning air felt colder than expected. The neighborhood was simple, well lived in, with small homes and quiet yards, nothing resembling the world she occupied, yet something about it felt honest. She walked slowly toward the address listed in the file, and stopped when she saw a man in the small driveway kneeling beside an old vehicle, his sleeves rolled up, his posture steady, focused completely on the task in front of him. He had not noticed her yet, but she already knew before he turned. Ethan Carter stood up, wiping his hands with a cloth, unaware that the past he had buried had just arrived in front of him in the form of a woman he once loved and lost for reasons neither of them had ever fully understood. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them filled with years instead of words, and in that silence, something fragile and long forgotten began to stir again, as if the world itself had paused to decide what would happen next. Victoria Hayes remained still for a moment that felt longer than it should have been as she stood at the edge of the quiet driveway, watching Ethan Carter straighten up from the old vehicle he had been repairing. The morning light fell across his shoulders in a way that made him look both familiar and distant at the same time. He slowly turned, sensing her presence, and when his eyes finally met hers, the air between them tightened with something neither of them had prepared for. There was no immediate greeting, no forced politeness, just a silence that carried the weight of years lost. Without explanation, Ethan's expression shifted, first from confusion to recognition, and then to something deeper that he could not fully control. Victoria felt it too, though she had spent her entire life learning how to hide emotional reactions behind control and precision. Now none of that seemed to matter. She took a small step forward, but stopped before closing the distance completely, as if afraid that movement alone might break something fragile that had just resurfaced. Ethan finally spoke her name quietly, as though testing whether it still belonged in the present. Victoria answered with a slight nod, her voice softer than she intended, asking if this was truly his home. He looked at her for a long moment before replying that it was, and then added that he had been living there with his daughter Sophie. The name struck her instantly, pulling her attention back to the reason she had come, but now the situation felt heavier than the file had ever suggested. Ethan wiped his hands again, more out of habit than necessity, and asked why she was there. Victoria hesitated for the first time in years, not because she lacked an answer, but because none of her prepared responses felt appropriate. She finally told him that she had come regarding Sophie Carter and the adoption process. Ethan's posture changed immediately, not aggressive, but protective, as if the mention of his daughter had shifted the ground beneath him. He said firmly that Sophie was his responsibility and that no system or corporation could decide otherwise. Victoria raised her hands slightly in a calming gesture, explaining that she was not there to take anything from him, but the words sounded inadequate even to her own ears. Sophie suddenly appeared at the side door of the house, drawn by the unfamiliar presence in the yard. She stood still, holding a small stuffed animal, her eyes moving between the two adults with quiet curiosity. Ethan noticed her immediately and softened his expression, telling her to go back inside gently. But Sophie did not move. Instead, she stepped forward a few feet and looked directly at Victoria, asking in a small, clear voice who she was. The question hung in the air like a suspended moment that neither adult could easily answer. Victoria knelt slightly, bringing herself closer to the child's level, her voice steady but unusually gentle as she introduced herself. Sophie studied her carefully, then turned to Ethan, as if seeking confirmation of safety. Ethan nodded reassuringly, though his eyes remained cautious. The interaction created an unspoken tension between all three of them, as if invisible lines of connection and separation were being redrawn in real time. Victoria slowly stood again, her attention returning to Ethan, telling him that she needed to speak with him privately about Sophie's future. Ethan immediately responded that Sophie's future was already with him, and that there was nothing to discuss. The firmness in his voice carried not anger, but certainty shaped by years of struggle and protection. Victoria did not argue. Instead, she looked at Sophie, once more noticing the way the child held her toy close, yet continued to watch her with quiet curiosity. Something about that gaze felt unsettlingly familiar, not in appearance, but in emotion, as if recognition was forming without explanation. The moment stretched until Sophie finally reached out and asked if Victoria was going to stay for a while, because she seemed lonely. The question landed softly, but deeply, causing both adults to pause. Victoria did not answer immediately, and instead looked toward Ethan, who stood silently processing the situation. The morning air between them felt heavier now, not with conflict, but with unresolved history pressing forward into the present, as if the past they had buried was no longer willing to remain hidden. And in that fragile silence, all three of them stood at the edge of something none of them yet understood, but none of them could turn away from. The silence that followed. Sophie's innocent question lingered in the air like something neither time nor logic could easily dissolve. Victoria Hayes stood still in the driveway of Ethan Carter's modest home, her mind trying to reconcile the child's words with the weight of everything unfolding. Ethan had instinctively stepped closer to Sophie, placing a gentle protective hand on her shoulder, not to shield her from danger, but from uncertainty. His eyes never left Victoria, as if measuring every breath she took for intent or meaning. Victoria slowly exhaled and told Sophie in a calm voice that she was not leaving, yet the words were simple, but they seemed to settle something inside the child. Sophie relaxed slightly, though her gaze remained curious, as if she was trying to understand why this woman felt important in a way she could not explain. Ethan then gently guided Sophie back toward the doorway, asking her to wait inside for a moment, promising he would follow shortly. Sophie hesitated, but eventually obeyed, disappearing into the house, leaving the two adults alone again in the quiet morning light. Victoria turned slightly toward Ethan, asking softly if they could talk somewhere private. Ethan agreed after a brief pause, leading her to a small wooden table set beside the side of the house, where the air smelled faintly of morning grass and distant rain. They sat across from each other, neither rushing into words, as if both understood that whatever came next could not be undone. Victoria finally spoke, explaining that she had come because of Sophie's adoption file, and that she needed clarity, not control. Ethan listened without interrupting, his hands resting on the table, steady but tense. When she finished, he leaned back slightly and said that Sophie was his daughter and no institution had ever done more for her than he had. Victoria acknowledged his words, but gently explained that her concern was not about taking Sophie away, but about understanding the full situation, including the child's legal and emotional stability. Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not with anger, but with exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of fighting unseen battles. He said quietly that stability was something he had built every single day through work, sacrifice, and presence, and that no document could measure that. Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing his response. Yet something in her eyes suggested that her questions were not only procedural. Ethan then asked her directly why she truly cared. Victoria hesitated again, longer this time, her composure wavering just enough for him to notice. She admitted that Sophie's file contained a name she recognized and that it let her hear. Ethan's posture shifted at the mention of recognition, and he asked whose name it was. Victoria looked down briefly before answering. Ethan Carter. The words hung between them like a thread pulled tight across years of silence. Ethan froze for a fraction of a second, then looked away, as if the name carried a weight he had long stopped expecting to hear from another person. He asked quietly what that meant. Victoria tried to explain that she was still trying to understand it herself, but before she could continue, Sophie's voice called from inside the house, asking if she could come outside again. The interruption broke the tension just enough for both adults to breathe. Ethan stood first, calling to Sophie that it was okay, she could join them. Sophie stepped back into the yard, slowly observing both of them carefully before walking to her father's side. She looked up at Victoria and asked if she knew her daddy from before, because he sometimes looked sad when people said his name. The question struck both adults differently. Ethan looked down immediately, while Victoria felt a subtle shift inside her, memory pressing harder against the surface. She gently told Sophie that she might have known him a long time ago. Sophie nodded, as if accepting that answer made sense to her, and then simply said that maybe that was why she felt like Victoria was not a stranger. The words settled into the space between them, soft but irreversible, as Ethan and Victoria exchanged a glance, neither fully prepared for what that realization might mean, and for the first time since arriving, Victoria understood that this was no longer just about a file or an adoption. It was about something that had been waiting quietly for years to return. The moment Sophie stepped back toward the house, the air between Victoria Hayes and Ethan Carter changed again, not louder, not sharper, but heavier, as if the space itself now carried memories neither of them had spoken aloud. Ethan remained standing beside the small wooden table, his eyes fixed on Victoria with a quiet tension that came from years of unanswered questions. Victoria slowly lowered her gaze for a brief moment before speaking again, her voice softer than before, asking if he had ever lived in Boston. Ethan frowned slightly, not understanding the direction of the question, but answered that he had spent several years there in his early adulthood, working different mechanical jobs, trying to stay stable after college. Victoria nodded slowly as if confirming something she had only partially remembered. She then asked if he had ever attended Northeastern University. Ethan paused longer this time, his expression tightening not with suspicion, but with the faint discomfort of old memories being touched. He confirmed that he had, and for a moment neither of them spoke again. The morning breeze moved gently through the yard, carrying the sound of distant traffic and rustling leaves, yet everything between them felt still. Victoria finally reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something she had not looked at in years. It was a small folded photograph, slightly worn at the edges. She hesitated before opening it, revealing an image of two young people standing outside a campus building, smiling in a way that felt distant, yet unmistakably real. Ethan's eyes shifted toward the photograph, and the moment he saw it, his entire posture changed subtly as recognition began to surface in slow, uncertain ways. Victoria watched him carefully, not rushing the moment, because something in his expression told her he already understood more than he was saying. Ethan stepped closer, his voice lower now, asking where she had gotten that photo. Victoria explained that it had been stored in a private box of personal items she had never thrown away from her younger years, items she had kept but never revisited. Ethan studied the image more closely and then looked at her again, as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the person in the photograph. His voice became quieter as he asked if she had been at Northeastern during the same years he was there. Victoria confirmed that she had, and for the first time her composure fully softened as she admitted that she remembered him not just as a passing acquaintance, but as someone who had once meant something significant in her life. Sophie's voice called again from inside the house, asking for her father, and the sound broke the fragile stillness just enough for Ethan to blink and slowly step back. But his eyes never left Victoria. Victoria folded the photograph carefully, her hands steady but no longer detached, and she said quietly that she had not expected to find him like this after all these years. Ethan responded that he had not expected to see her at all, let alone standing in his driveway asking questions about a child he was raising alone. There was no anger in his tone, only disbelief layered with caution. Sophie appeared again at the doorway, holding her stuffed animal, watching both of them closely, as if sensing that something important was happening, even if she could not understand it. Ethan gently told her everything was fine and asked her to stay near the door for a moment. Victoria looked at Sophie, then back at Ethan, and for the first time she admitted that she did not come here with a plan anymore. She came because something about this situation did not feel random. Ethan exhaled slowly, acknowledging that he did not trust coincidences either. The silence returned, but this time it was different, less like distance and more like recognition forming in fragments neither of them could yet assemble fully. And as the morning light shifted across the yard, both Victoria Hayes and Ethan Carter stood at the edge of a truth that had been waiting quietly for years, finally beginning to reveal itself through a child who unknowingly connected everything back together. The tension that had been quietly building between Victoria Hayes and Ethan Carter finally shifted the moment Sophie's small voice echoed again from the doorway, asking if they were finished talking, because she wanted to show her father something she had drawn. The interruption was simple, yet it broke the fragile silence like a thread snapping under pressure. Ethan immediately softened his expression, turning toward his daughter and asking her to come closer. Victoria watched the interaction, carefully noticing how quickly Ethan's entire presence changed the moment Sophie was near him. The guarded uncertainty in his posture dissolved into something steadier, something rooted in protection and care. Sophie walked forward, holding a small crayon drawing in her hands, showing a house with 3 figures standing in front of it. She pointed at one figure and said that was her father. Then she hesitated and pointed at another figure, asking quietly if that could be Victoria. Ethan glanced at the drawing and gently told Sophie that Victoria was just visiting, but Sophie did not look convinced. She said that Victoria did not feel like a stranger, which caused a brief silence to fall between the adults. Again, Victoria knelt slightly to Sophie's level, studying the drawing more closely, and told her it was very beautiful. Sophie smiled faintly, then stepped back toward her father, leaving the 2 adults alone again in the yard. Ethan exhaled slowly and said that Sophie tended to feel things strongly and sometimes imagined connections where there were none. Victoria replied calmly that children often see what adults miss. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before responding that he was not sure what she was trying to find here. Victoria admitted that she was not entirely sure either, but that Sophie's adoption file had led her to him. and that there were details she could not ignore. Ethan's expression tightened slightly as he said that he had already signed every document proving he was fit to raise his daughter and that no one had questioned him before. Victoria responded carefully, explaining that this was not about questioning his ability, but about understanding the past. Ethan shook his head slightly, saying that the past did not change what he had built with Sophie. Now Victoria took a breath and finally said that she believed the past might be more connected than either of them realized. Ethan frowned, asking what she meant, and Victoria hesitated before saying that she remembered him from years ago, and that Sophie's presence was making things she had long buried begin to surface. Ethan froze for a brief moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in anger, but in disbelief, as he asked if she was suggesting they had known each other before. Victoria confirmed quietly that they had, and that she had only recently realized how much she had forgotten. Ethan looked away for a moment, processing the weight of her words, before saying that he did not understand why she would disappear from someone's life only to return years later asking questions about his daughter. Victoria lowered her gaze, admitting that she did not have a simple answer, and that she had spent years building a life that left no space for the past. Ethan responded with a quiet firmness that Sophie was not part of any unresolved history, and that he would not allow confusion to affect her stability. Victoria immediately agreed, stating that Sophie's well-being was her only concern, and that she was not there to disrupt anything. Sophie's voice called again from inside the house, asking if she could show Victoria her room. This time Ethan hesitated, but then allowed it, telling Sophie to be polite. Sophie grabbed Victoria's hand with surprising ease, pulling her gently toward the house, leaving Ethan standing alone in the yard watching them go, as something inside him tightened, not from fear, but from the realization that the life he had carefully built was now standing at the edge of something he could no longer fully control. And as Victoria followed Sophie into the house, she glanced back briefly at Ethan, sensing that every answer she uncovered was only leading to a deeper question neither of them was ready to face. Inside the small living room of Ethan Carter's home, the atmosphere felt quieter but far more charged as Sophie proudly showed Victoria Hayes her drawings spread carefully across a worn wooden table, each picture filled with bright colors and simple shapes that reflected a child's sense of safety and imagination. Victoria knelt beside her, gently asking questions about each drawing. Sophie explained everything with enthusiasm, pointing out herself, her father, and even adding a small figure labeled as friend, which she carefully placed between them. Ethan stood near the doorway, watching closely, his arms crossed, not out of hostility, but out of instinctive protection, as he observed every interaction between Sophie and Victoria, trying to understand the nature of this unexpected presence in their lives. Victoria smiled softly at Sophie's explanations, but her attention occasionally drifted toward Ethan, as if part of her mind was still trying to reconcile the present moment with something buried deep in memory. Sophie suddenly ran off to another room to bring more drawings, leaving Victoria and Ethan alone again in the living room. The silence returned immediately, heavier than before. Ethan finally spoke, asking what exactly she remembered from the past. Victoria hesitated for a moment, then said that she could not remember everything clearly, but certain fragments were becoming impossible to ignore. Ethan frowned slightly, asking her to be more specific. Victoria slowly reached into her coat and pulled out the same folded photograph she had shown before, placing it carefully on the table between them. Ethan looked at it, and this time his reaction was different. His expression tightened as recognition fully settled, and not just of the image but of the moment it represented. Victoria watched his face carefully and asked quietly if he remembered it. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he sat down slowly, as if the weight of memory had physically shifted him back years. His voice finally broke the silence, saying that the photograph was taken during their university years in Boston, and that it was from a day he had almost forgotten, but clearly had not. Victoria nodded, confirming that she remembered that day too, though at the time she had never fully understood its significance. Ethan leaned forward slightly, saying that after graduation, life had pulled them in different directions without explanation or closure. Victoria's voice softened as she admitted that she had once thought the separation was intentional on his part. Ethan immediately shook his head, denying that, firmly stating that he had tried to reach out once, but never received a response. The admission created a pause between them, one filled not with anger, but with missed chances and unanswered questions. Sophie returned at that moment, holding another drawing, but stopped when she sensed the shift in energy between the two adults. She walked slowly to the table and placed the drawing down, asking if everything was okay. Ethan quickly reassured her that everything was fine, but Victoria's eyes remained on the photograph. Sophie looked at it curiously and asked if that was her daddy when he was younger. Ethan nodded, gently confirming it. Sophie then smiled and said that Victoria looked like she belonged in the picture too. The words caused both adults to fall silent again. Victoria slowly looked at Ethan and said that Sophie might be seeing connections that were real, even if they had not fully understood them. Yet Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Victoria with a mixture of uncertainty and recognition, as if realizing that the life he had carefully rebuilt was now intersecting with a past he had long believed was gone. And as Sophie quietly returned to her drawings, the fragile space between memory, truth, and present reality grew thinner, leaving all three of them standing at the edge of something none of them could yet define. The house fell into a rare kind of silence after Sophie drifted off to another room, leaving Victoria Hayes and Ethan Carter alone in the living room, where sunlight now felt softer and more uncertain as it passed through the window. Ethan remained seated, this time his posture no longer defensive, but weighed down by something closer to memory than suspicion. Victoria sat across from him with the folded photograph still resting on the table between them, like an unspoken truth waiting to be fully acknowledged. Ethan finally spoke in a low, steady voice, saying that after that year in Boston, everything had changed for both of them, not because of choice, but because of distance, circumstance, and timing that never aligned. Victoria listened without interrupting, her hands resting gently in her lap, though her expression revealed a quiet tension. Ethan continued, explaining that he had tried once to reach out after graduation, but the message never seemed to find its way, and when no response came, he assumed she had moved on completely. Victoria lowered her gaze for a moment before admitting that she had never received anything, and that her life afterward had become consumed by opportunity and expectation until there was no space left for anything that resembled the past. Ethan looked down at the photograph again and said that sometimes life does not erase people, it only hides them until something brings them back into view. Victoria nodded slowly, acknowledging that Sophie had become that unexpected connection between two lives that had drifted too far apart to recognize each other. Ethan leaned back, slightly processing everything, not with anger, but with a deep, quiet understanding that the past had not ended cleanly, it had simply fractured. Victoria then asked softly if he had ever thought about what might have happened if things had been different. Ethan gave a faint, uncertain smile, saying that he had stopped asking that question a long time ago, because it had no place in raising a child alone. Victoria looked toward the hallway, where Sophie had disappeared moments earlier, and said that sometimes life answers those questions in ways no one expects. Ethan followed her gaze and agreed quietly that Sophie had always been that answer for him, even before he knew why. The moment lingered between them, not as conflict, but as realization slowly forming into acceptance. Sophie suddenly returned, holding another drawing, but stopped when she saw both adults sitting closer now. Not speaking, she looked at them curiously and asked if they were friends. Ethan hesitated before answering gently that they were still figuring things out. Sophie seemed satisfied with that answer and placed her drawing on the table, showing a picture of three figures standing together under a bright sun. She pointed at each one, naming herself, her father, and Victoria, then added softly that it looked right even if she did not know why. Victoria felt her breath catch slightly as she studied the drawing, realizing how naturally the child had placed her into a place she had not been invited into, but somehow already belonged. Ethan noticed Victoria's reaction, and for the first time his expression softened completely, not guarded, not uncertain, but quietly open, as if accepting that whatever this was, it was no longer something either of them could simply walk away from. And as Sophie smiled proudly at her drawing, the room filled with a calm that felt fragile but real, as if the past had finally stopped running from them and was now waiting for them to decide what to do with it. Thank you for watching until the end of this video. We truly appreciate your time and support. Please share your thoughts and feelings about this story in the comments section below. Do not forget to subscribe to Poor Girl's Destiny for more emotional and inspiring stories like this. Stay blessed and see you in the next video.